Hi everyone, welcome to our latest Friday exchange here at the Police Foundation. My name is Rick Muir, I'm Director of the Foundation, and this is the thing that we do once a month to talk to an interesting person who has interesting things to say about policing. And I'm delighted today we've got with us Sarah Charman, who is Professor of Criminology at the University of Portsmouth. And has been doing a huge amount of really interesting research on policing over many years. And we're going to talk about her work and the implications of it for discussions about policing. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much indeed, Rick, and hopefully it will be interesting. You've set me up for failure there.
No, I'm sure it will be. It will be interesting. And for those of you who haven't been to our Friday exchanges before, just a couple of things to mention at the beginning. One is that we do record these sessions and they will be available on YouTube. So just please bear that in mind if you want to make any comments in the chat or anything like that, that these things will be available on YouTube. And yes, if you want to ask Sarah a question, please just use the chat function. So if you just sort of, as we're talking, just put questions in there, and I'll pull them out as we go along, and that'll just help keep the conversation going. So if you have a thought, have a question, have a comment, just pop it in the chat, and we'll pick it up. But great. Well, I mean, Sarah, if you could, it'd be good to start if you could tell us a bit about how you ended up researching in the world of policing.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you for the invitation today. A little bit by accident, if I'm honest. I've got my lovely late father to thank for that, because I was collecting degrees because I was enjoying myself, and he said very politely, Sarah, I think it's time you went and found yourself a job now. So I saw a 12-month research assistant contract going to do a project on the Association of Chief Police Officers, and I thought, well, I'll do that for a year, and then I'll think of something more interesting to do afterwards. But it only took me that 1 year of doing that project with the then ACPO, now National Police Chiefs Council, which just got me really hooked into policing. So as an unbelievably naive 22-year-old, I was hurled on a train and told to go around England and Wales for the next year, interviewing chief constables, deputy chief constables and assistant chief constables, and indeed past presidents of ACPO as well. So people with policing experience right back to the 1940s. To talk to them about the Association of Chief Police Officers, how they developed chief officer culture. So I met, people like John Alderson, the wonderful John Alderson at Devon and Cornwall Police, one of the proponents of community policing. I had tea and biscuits with James Anderton and his wife, the famous God's Cop from Greater Manchester Police. So it was a real baptism of fire. But I think what was brilliant about the project is that I was seen to be, an incompetent, really, by many senior police officers, that I wouldn't necessarily, what is the expression? I think it's Laughlin who talks about young women researchers being seen often by police officers as acceptable incompetence. So I was seen in that way that they could tell me anything, and they told me far too much, but it was a brilliant induction, I suppose, into policing research.
That's amazing. I mean, that's amazing that your first project was working with all those people. That's brilliant. And can I just ask, what did that project conclude? I mean, because ultimately ACPO ended up being abolished by Theresa May in 2010 and replaced by the NPCC. I mean, was there anything that you found at that stage which heralded its demise, or what was going on?
No, I don't think so, because when we were doing our interviews, this was in the mid-1990s, and they were sort of at the height of their fame at that time. And I think what had been so interesting about the way the organisation manoeuvred and manipulated itself and its members, that you'd got, Rick, hugely independent, fiercely independent chief constables there who would paint their patrol cars a different colour just so they were different to the force next door. And yet what ACPO managed to do was coordinate them to start speaking in one voice. And that was an incredible feat during that time. So actually in the mid-1990s, when we were interviewing them, they were very much of the idea that, yes, we should be speaking as one voice. And they were incredibly powerful during that time. They went to the Home Office with a shopping list of changes that they wanted to see, and basically ticked them all off the list as various Home Secretaries agreed with them. So I think that, I think they noticed and realised the benefits of working together, I think, in a way perhaps that the NPCC might consider thinking about now.
Yeah, no, because that sounds quite different to how it works now. Whereas it's, I mean, definitely with the relationship with government, where I just don't think they certainly can't turn up with a shopping list and get everything they want. And every time I speak to some NPCC portfolio lead, they tell me it's like sort of herding cats, trying to get everyone to agree. But so a really interesting way into policing. And one of the things that you've done a lot of work on is around police culture. So I wonder if we could sort of start with that. And I guess from the research that you've done, I mean, obviously police culture is in the sort of headlines a lot, particularly post the Casey review, because of all of the issues that we know about. But what are the things that have come out of your research that you think are most important in terms of police culture, the things that are really relevant to, you know, the public debate and discussion about policing today?
It's a really interesting project, Rick. Actually, I took 2 cohorts of brand new police officers who were joining one particular force, and I followed them over the first 4 years of their career. So I interviewed them on 4 separate occasions over 4 years. So that enabled me not just to get a snapshot of what they felt was the culture of the organisation and their position within it, but actually see that changing attitude from them as they were socialised into the organisation and their changing perceptions of what policing was all about. So you can imagine after 4 years, there was just an enormous mass of data that was gathered, and I published a book on it. But actually, you know, and I spoke about the 6 what I called emerging and enduring characteristics of policing, which were that there was still a lot of traditional characteristics of policing, but actually that there were some other characteristics that we perhaps don't always recognise, you know, in the development of culture as it goes on. And I think what I also came to realise is that the police service, I think, has or had taken its eye off the ball a little bit with police culture. If we look at, you know, what happened with Macpherson, and then we look at what happened with Casey, what developments have taken place during that time? Now, it's perfectly understandable why they took their eye off the ball. You know, that huge amounts of budget cuts during the last decade or so, the introduction of police and crime commissioners, huge complexity of crime to deal with. You've got the introduction of the police education qualification frameworks. You've got the huge amount of non-crime demand, and then you throw in a global pandemic as well. So it's no wonder in a way that they took their eye off the ball around cultural reform. And I think as well, we can't let universities off the hook as well, because I think, you know, the higher education sector took its eye off the ball in that regard as well. There was an element of chasing where the money might be from higher education institutions. So there was a focus much more on providing solutions to police services, for example, or, you know, for looking at evaluative research, but perhaps not concentrating as much on the culture of policing. So, yeah, I think when we look at, you know, I think the policing organisation has managed to put the fires out. You know, if we look at some of the big events around policing cultures of the last decade or so, but I don't really think that it's looked at some of the deep-rooted occupational cultures of police, but also considered, and I think this is what I also took from the research, that there are many benefits to officers of that culture, and there are many positive aspects of policing cultures. And if we just focus on it with that kind of stick mentality, we will beat this culture out of you, then I think we're ignoring actually what the benefits are to officers of things like that camaraderie, that support, and that loyalty, for example.
Yeah, yeah, so there are huge sort of benefits to that. But do you think in the time that you've looked at police culture, do you think it's changed very much? I mean, has there been significant change over that time? Or because I mean, sometimes, you know, reading Casey, I mean, it's clear some things have changed, but some of the things that were highlighted there have been known to be problems for a very long time, and maybe, as you say, the spotlight had gone off them, but they were still there. So what's your perception? Has police culture changed very much?
I don't think cultures can possibly stand still. I really don't agree with that idea that they stand still. But the change is so glacial. It's so slow. I kind of liken it to rock sedimentation. That, you know, these new characteristics of culture will come in and land at the top, but actually it takes an awful long time for them to have that impact. So I think there are roots of change. I think the focus around one of the cultural characteristics that I talked about in that research, which was greeted with a bit of shock when I first talked about it, was around officers using compassion and showing compassion, and actually compassion being a feature and a characteristic of policing cultures. When I first talked about that, I could only find one article by Maurice Punch who talked about compassion in policing, yet now we see that expression talked about more and more. I mean, Mark Rowley has it in his Met turnaround plan in terms of the importance of compassion. It's part of the proposed values, it's part of the 9 priorities. So I think compassion is becoming much more central within policing, and officers are talking about it much more. There's a brilliant PhD which I recently examined from a Cambridge student, Mike Bryden, and he was looking at the way that police officers talk about themselves and their work, and he said they were much more likely to talk about the moral dimensions of their work rather than those characteristics such as I'm a good thief taker, but they would say things like I'm fair, I'm impartial. So I think we are beginning to see a difference in younger recruits as they come through, but these things take so much time.
And I noticed you talked about cultures there in plural. So, I mean, and that's quite important, isn't it? Because I mean, sometimes we talk about this thing as if it's a homogenous culture, but there's more than one culture, or there are different gradations of culture, or however you want to describe it. But it's not true, is it, that it is just one thing? There are different types of cultures in different parts of policing as well.
Absolutely, and we've got to be so conscious of that. And I think it's quite lazy just to talk about culture as if there's just one. Like you would talk about higher education culture as if there was just one. There are multiple cultures within policing. You only have to look at the Casey report to look at some of those areas around, firearms or royalty and diplomatic protection. You'll see very different cultures in those organisations. I mean, I know when I was doing some research on interoperability between police and paramedics, and I visited one police station, and there was a fridge with a lock on the door, and that was for traffic officers. And they would not countenance the idea that any other officer would be allowed the milk from their fridge. So there are distinct occupational cultures within policing, and certainly from my research, I was noticing it with the way officers talk about different shifts. We're okay, we're A shift are fine, but you don't have anything to do with D shift. They're a completely different level of fish.
Yeah, absolutely. And on this thing about compassion, I mean, so people often working in sort of jobs which are difficult and where they encounter a lot of trauma will talk about compassion fatigue, for example. So I mean, is that something you found? Is it that for police officers, is it harder to remain compassionate as you go along because it's just because you just see so much bad stuff and difficult stuff that it just kind of wears you down? I mean, did anything on that come out of your work?
Not particularly on that, but I suppose just thinking about that idea of compassion fatigue, if that is the case, and if officers are coming back into their organisation suffering with the compassion fatigue and the demands of the job in that way, then actually there's even more of a demand for the organisation to be showing that compassion towards its officers and its staff who are traumatized by the nature of their work. So I'm sure I'll be accused of being a woolly sociologist here, but actually this is hard-nosed operational policing, but actually there is so much evidence to suggest that a compassionate organisation is one that therefore has much higher levels of organisational commitment, much higher levels of job satisfaction, for example. So compassion is absolutely central within organisations. I'm sure you know of Dr. Fiona Meakin who used to work at the College of Policing. She's just completed her PhD in this area and has a whole raft of evidence as to the benefits of an organisation that acts compassionately towards its employees. So, Mark Rowley has compassion as front and central in his Met turnaround plan in terms of communication and behaviour with the public. But, we also need to look inside the organisation about how officers and staff are treated themselves.
Yes, I mean, this links to this whole area of organisational justice, which is important. I mean, do we have good research which shows that there is a relationship between the degree of organisational justice within police organisations and the perception of justice in the way the police relate to the public? Because I mean, if those two things can be connected, then that's quite a powerful driver for change, I would think.
And there's plenty of evidence of that, Rick, and you know it well. You've cited this in the Strategic Review of Policing, that there is evidence that the way that people are treated within their own organisations will have an impact on the way that they treat others outside of that organisation. So, there is a whole plethora of evidence around what fairness and being treated and being perceived to be treated fairly within your own organisation has linked to. And this list of benefits around compliance, around higher levels of officer well-being, less cynicism, greater job satisfaction, but then looking towards the outside as well, less likelihood of misconduct, less likelihood of adhering to the Blue Code of Silence, less likelihood of supporting use of force, more support of democratic policing. It's almost a list of things that every chief constable in the country would like to see in their organisation, and all of those things come from officers being treated fairly or being perceived to be treated fairly by their organisation. So it's not just about, oh, let's make our officers feel better, let's make our staff feel better for all the obvious reasons, but actually it's important in terms of their relationship with the public.
Yeah. We've got a question here from Dave Burns, which I'll put to you because it's linked to these questions. So, is it right to look at culture of organisations such as the police in isolation from the culture of society in general? I say that given culture can be influenced by power, amongst other things, and wider influences can have an impact, both positive and negative. So can we think about police culture in isolation from the wider context around it?
No, I don't think so. I think Dave's absolutely right in that. We haven't plucked these police officers from another planet and put them into policing. They're part of their communities. So absolutely, it reflects. The cultures of any organisation will reflect the society in which those people are operating and living in. But yeah, I think policing cultures are particularly powerful because of the occupational stresses and strains of being a police officer, and because of the natural position that they are in terms of having that position of power and authority over the public, does place them in a particular position. And they are, the phrase is dirty workers. They're dealing with the difficult parts of life and society. So that does put them in a particular situation, I think, that encourages more or bigger boundaries that they put around themselves in terms of the exclusivity of the groups that they create when they're categorizing and self-categorizing and identifying within groups. So I think those groups are more powerful, but nonetheless, they are still, as Dave said, they're still influenced by what's going on outside.
Yeah. And your this links to another theme which you've worked on, which is around leadership. Because I mean, I've certainly in our strategic review, we sort of said, well, one of the key things for achieving culture change, where you need culture change, is good and effective leadership. And you've done a lot of work. I mean, going back to your work on ACPO on police leaders. I mean, I guess the first question on that is similar to the culture question. Have you noticed much change in the nature of police leadership in the time since you did that work in the mid-90s, and the kind of police leadership and the models of leadership used in policing today?
They certainly look different. I mean, when I was addressing, and you've done the same, Rick, when I was addressing the MPCC conference a couple of years ago, they certainly look a different crowd than they did in the ACPO days of the mid-90s. Whether there's a huge difference in the way that they lead, I'm not entirely sure. I think one of the difficulties is that people who get to the top of the police organisation are quite invested in the system in which they've got to the top. They've been very successful in that system. So it's quite difficult sometimes for people to challenge the system that they were very successful in. But I think the organisation needs to, as far as it can, with the operational demands of policing, just move away from that sort of command and control style of policing. And the things I've talked about fairness and compassion, about the damaging impact that rank can have and hierarchy can have in the institution. So I think it's difficult to tell if it has genuinely changed or if they just look different.
Yeah. And you've done, I wanted to touch on, I mean, one of the ways it's changed is obviously there are many more women leaders, as you say. And I know that you've done work looking at the specific challenges that women leaders face in policing. And I just wondered if you could say something about that. What are those barriers or additional challenges they face, and have we seen much progress in dealing with them?
I think the danger, Rick, is that we look at the numbers and we think, aren't we doing well? We've got almost 35% of officers in the police service now are women. We're doing so much better than other countries. We've got flexible work arrangement policies in place. Officers can now join part-time. It all sounds fantastic. But when you look sort of underneath the bonnet a little bit more, there are still a huge number of structural and cultural obstacles which are hindering women's progress to get to the top. Marissa Silvestri has talked about this for years, that time within policing is a real gendered concept. Because in order to get to the top, you have to go through all of those ranks, and it takes time. And for women, that's more challenging. It's more challenging because they don't apply for sergeant in the same numbers that men do. They wait probably a little bit too long. And also they inevitably take periods of absence during maternity leave, for example, which hinders their ability to get to the top. But it's not just those structural challenges, they're also hindered by cultural challenges as well. And the research that you mentioned that was conducted by a doctoral student of mine, Jackie Alexander, she looks at women's progression and route to the top. And I think there are two really interesting findings that she came out with there. One was around temporary promotions. So she sent out freedom of information requests to all forces, didn't get a huge response. I think it was only 7 forces that responded and said they had availability of that data. But what she found with temporary promotions was, out of, I think it was 1,600 temporary promotions that were reported, over 80% of those went to men. And if you look just at chief superintendents, it was 90%. So if temporary promotion, as we all know, is the key to then getting substantial promotion, then that's one way that that it's not so easy for them to get to the top. And the second really interesting finding was around the impact of childcare on senior women within the police. So she also asked the question of all superintendents and above who had children, who takes the responsibility in your relationship for organising childcare? Well, 42.6% of women, senior women, said that they took responsibility for it, and 0.7% of senior men in the police took responsibility for organising childcare. So that's another significant barrier that women are facing, trying to balance that the impact of childcare and family responsibilities on getting to the top. So yes, we have got much better in terms of representation, but Marissa Silvestri talks about this progression and regression in terms of women getting to the top. So it's not all, I think, as it looks if you just look at the bare stats.
Yeah, and this is a comment that Fiona Eldridge makes, so she says the pipeline below chief officers suggests that as this cohort retire, we'll see more men again. Temporary promotion point reflected in cohort 1 of the executive leadership program. So a perception there that actually we may see a bit of a regression on that, and we certainly saw that in the past. And we saw more women coming in, and then it went really low for a bit, and then it's come back now. But it's clearly a challenge. We've got a few other questions I'll just put to you broadly around these issues. So Jamie Hobday says, Sarah, do you have any views on the usefulness of the institutional approach to studying organisational culture, particularly policing? I'm not familiar with that, Sarah, so I don't know if you are.
Neither am I, actually.
Okay, well, there we are. Okay.
Jamie might need to just
maybe Jamie, if you could describe what the institutional approach is and put it in the chat, we'll come back to that. And Mary Fraser says, Sarah, do you know of information on the background of police officers recruited since 2020, their previous jobs before they entered the police service? I assume this may have an impact on current performance. Do we know anything really about the wave of recruits since 2020?
I don't personally know the details of those who've been recruited by forces in answer to Mary's question, but I think it reflects a wider problem, is that the police service may not know either. Whenever I talk to anyone within policing about, can I have access to this data, or do you have this data, it's not collected. So I've recently sent out freedom of information requests to all forces to collect a variety of pieces of data, including, characteristics of those who are leaving the organisation, about the numbers of people who have a declared disability within services. And so many forces will get back to me and say, we don't have that data. So I think the organisation itself needs to understand more about the data that it hasn't got in order to tackle some of these problems. In terms of new recruits, I'm not entirely sure. I know that obviously, and we'll probably come on to this, the issue of retention amongst new recruits is a big concern, but I don't have the details on the types. Only that, in many forces, over 50% of those who are joining at the moment are female. But we also know that women are much more likely to voluntarily resign than men. So we're getting a lot in, but it's about keeping them in.
Yeah, well, let's touch on retention then, because I think obviously that's it's a big theme at the moment, and lots of people are talking about it. We've had this big wave of recruitment, but forces are reporting that they're higher levels of people leaving, and I know you've done work on this, and I just wondered if you could tell us something about what are the things that are undermining retention rates within policing?
You've touched on my favourite research project now, Rick, so I could talk about this all day. So just wave at me when you want me to stop. But it was something that started when I was doing that research with new recruits to the service, and I was quite interested that a few of them were already saying to me, well, this is fine for now. I'll do this for now. And I thought, well, isn't policing a job for life? Isn't this what we're always told? So I thought, well, let me try and dig around and find out a bit more about who's leaving. And I tried, this was 5 or 6 years ago, maybe longer. I tried to do that and could find nothing. There really was no information on who was leaving and why they were leaving. So with my colleague, Dr Gemma Tyson at the University of Portsmouth, we've been looking at this for the last 5 or 6 years. We did a survey and interviews with officers who'd left one particular force, and then we've done a national project looking at officers who've left all forces in England and Wales. So we've conducted almost 100 lengthy, emotional, semi-structured interviews with officers who have prematurely left the police service. And we've categorised the reasons why they're leaving as under the umbrella of what we've called organisational injustice. So out of those almost 100, one officer said that they left because they didn't like the job. They didn't like the occupation of policing. Policing wasn't for them. Every single other one said it was due to the organisation. And those were the four main reasons that they were talking to us about. Were about poor leadership. It was around a lack of voice. It was around difficulties in promotion and progression opportunities. And it was around feelings of around the inflexibility of the organisation. So organisation inflexibility. So those are the 4 reasons that we came out with in terms of why officers were leaving. And I can talk a bit more about those if you want.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because it's really interesting. Well, I mean, because it's a bit of a counterpoint to the sort of often said thing, which is that you hear particularly senior leaders in policing saying, well, it's all because they're a bit soft and they can't cope with working nights and and all that sort of stuff. And you didn't find that, did you? You found that there were these other reasons behind it.
Yeah, and I've heard that. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that, Rick, from officers around the country. They're snowflakes. They didn't know they had to work night shifts. They were getting their mum to ring in for them. And these are all, okay, there's probably 1 or 2 around the country, but this has become a myth as to why officers are leaving the organisation. Not helped by organisations as well that say it's all to do with pay, because that wasn't a reason that we discovered either. And I think that if senior officers can put the blame onto leavers themselves as to why they're leaving the organisation, it wasn't for them, then they don't have to take responsibility that actually a lot of this is around organisational failure. Because these officers, the other thing I hear is that, this generation, they just want to move from one job to another. That wasn't what we found from our research. These were people who'd had a long-held desire, childhood desire in many cases, to be a police officer. They weren't leaving because they fancied another job or a change of scene. They were leaving because they felt they had no option to do so, and they felt the organisation had let them down. So I think we need to move away quickly from this idea that it's the responsibility of the leaver. It's actually the responsibility of the organisation to do something about it.
Is it that I mean, there's a slight variation on that, which I'll put to you, which is it that people's expectations of how organisations should treat them have changed? In other words, do we as a society just expect more of organisations, and those organisations that haven't moved with the times and are not meeting their expectations are not going to be able to retain people? Is that something that you think has some sort of validity?
No, I would agree with that. I mean, in some cases, these officers were just treated appallingly, and no matter what generation you would be from, there's simply no way that should be tolerated. But I do agree with you, and I think the service has got to be mindful of that. It wanted, or it wants, I'm never quite sure, to be an all-graduate profession, and yet it's expecting these officers to come in and then not want to have promotion and progression opportunities available to them. That's not going to wash anymore. There's plenty of research on both millennials and Gen Z to suggest they want meaning in their jobs. They're motivated by meaning. They're concerned with having their voice heard, and they want the opportunity for promotion and progression. And those were 2 things that we found that officers were leaving for, because they weren't having their voice heard. They weren't allowed to challenge. They weren't allowed to speak up or offer their opinions. And that's a real problem in today's society. And I'll go back again to this idea of rank and hierarchy. It can be incredibly corrosive, I think, in policing.
Yeah, and we just got a question on this from Ruth, which is, what are your thoughts on the role of rigid hierarchies in retention? Should there be a movement towards flatter hierarchies in modern policing?
Gosh, yes, just a great big yes. And I think it's got to happen. And chief officers say all the right thing, don't they? We want to hear your views. You know, we're open to challenge. We're open to hearing what you think. But are they really? Are they really open to those challenges? They'll send around a survey, but do they really want to hear those challenging voices? And I'm not sure they do. I'll just give you an example, and the force will clearly remain nameless. But a retention team from one force got in touch with me and said, would I come and visit the force and talk to them about some of the retention ideas they'd got and how that fitted with the evidence that we'd gathered? And we said, well, of course we'll come. We fixed up a date. I then got a phone call to say that the senior leadership team of that force wanted to be there and they wanted to hear the talk. I said, no problem, as many as you can fit in the room. But the retention team were then told they couldn't be in there. So only the senior leadership team could be in there, because they didn't want the retention team, who were all of constable and sergeant rank, to be in the room with them. I mean, at which point I withdrew my offer to go. But that sums up a lot of what's wrong in policing, that the people, the experts, the retention team, couldn't hear the benefits of the discussion around retention because of the hierarchy.
Yeah. There's a comment here from Kyle. I agree, Sarah. I joined the police with the aim of staying for my whole career. I left 2 years ago as a sergeant after 16 years of service. At no point did the organisation ask me why, or to be honest, even care. There you are. Sorry to hear that, Carl.
Yeah, and that, Carl, sums up the story that we've heard so much. And I think there's a danger in another assumption, Rick, is that all of these officers who are leaving are 1 to 2 years in, and that's absolutely not the case. The danger is that it's people like Carl who are leaving, who've got a wealth of experience and talent and skills, and they're the ones leaving the organisation, which ends up with the result that now a third of all officers have got less than 5 years service. So, and Carl also makes another really important point, that nobody asked him why he wanted to go. How can the organisation expect to do better on retaining its existing staff if it doesn't know, if it falls back on some of those tropes and assumptions about why officers are leaving? So from our research, I think it was only about a third of officers were offered, they called it an exit interview, but sometimes it was just a form from HR with pre-populated boxes to tick. I think only a third of those who were offered it took it. So what it ended up with was that 4 people out of our entire sample had anything positive to say about the leaving process. Even if they do have an exit interview of some sort, whether it's a cup of tea or a chat in the corridor, it's not recorded, and then it's certainly not analysed. So forces still don't know enough about why their officers are leaving in order to try and address it. So Carl's situation and his experience, unfortunately, is very familiar.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? Because you hear police forces saying this is a really big problem for them. They're investing all this money in training, then they lose people. It's a very significant issue. HMIC, FRS has highlighted it as a big problem. And yet everything you're saying is that the things that you need to do to tackle this are in the hands of the organisation itself. I mean, it's not like there's some kind of external factor, which is, because sometimes you hear, oh well, particularly forces around London will say it's because we're competing with the Met and that makes it very difficult. And no doubt there are some specific issues there, but all of those factors that you highlighted are things that are within their gift to change.
Absolutely right. Absolutely. And our findings are no different from others. There is some really good work going on in Greater Manchester Police. Chief Inspector Mike Russell and his stay interviews, and they are analysing the findings of those stay interviews, where they're trying to intervene at a much earlier stage, talk to officers when they were at that first out stage about wanting to leave the organisation. They analysed their data over a year, and I think they got a 72% retention rate from those officers who were either very much planning to leave or who had even got job offers elsewhere, and they managed to retain 72% of them. I know there was some backlash in the force about, do we really want to be doing this? It's, are we encouraging people to just moan about their particular role or their shift pattern? But actually, if you lay it down in broad financial terms, you are saving X million pounds through actually not having to recruit and train new officers. Then actually you can see the financial benefits of it, then I think it becomes even more tempting, I think, for chief officers to think really closely about some of those retention strategies.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder whether there's something about, can policing learn more in terms of leadership and management from other sectors? Because, most people who've risen to the top in policing have spent all their careers in policing and are sort of, and if you like, are used to a particular way of particular methods of of running the organisation, whereas there might be things they could learn from the outside, which might actually be beneficial, particularly in sectors which have less of an issue with retention.
And that's why this new focus on the National Centre for Police Leadership, I think, looking at leadership at all levels in the service is really, really important, and not just saving the leadership development for when you get to chief superintendent level, because it's the first line supervisors where a lot of the issues were for our leavers in terms of the lack of support that they were getting from sergeants. I'm not blaming sergeants for this. They have a lack of training, a lack of experience, and a ridiculous workload. So they are finding it difficult to manage all of that. But that's where those perceptions of a lack of support amongst our leavers was really coming from that kind of sergeant and inspector level.
Yeah, and that's something we found in our strategic review as well. And it's, as you say, it's good that, that I think the college is now starting to focus on that as a sort of key, as a key issue through the new leadership centre. So hopefully we'll see some better support for sergeants coming through there. Matt Bradley says, Sarah, what do you think about the idea that officers are staying? So I think staying in policing due to the pension trap. In other words, you stay your 30 years because because of the pension at the end, and that creates poor morale and culture, because basically there are some people who are staying who shouldn't stay, but they're staying for the pension. What do you think about that argument?
Yeah, I think that's really difficult within policing. We know that there's a problem of retention, but what we don't know is kind of underneath the tip of that iceberg and we know the data from Police Federation surveys, but the number of people with an intention to leave. So that's problematic because that can create really negative cultures, because they want to leave, but they can't, or they don't for whatever reason. And one of those can be because indeed because of the pension trap. So yeah, I think that causes real problems. I know from the research that I did with the new recruits to the service that they found some of those negative attitudes and real kind of hard-nosed cynicism from some officers who simply didn't want to be there anymore. They found that really difficult in those early days. We know from research that actually police officers, unlike other professions, police officers join their organisation with very high levels of organisational commitment. Most professions, people join with much lower levels of organisational commitment, and it grows. Within policing, sadly, it's the other way around. They're joining with very high levels of organisational commitment, and we know often huge levels of enthusiasm, but that starts to dissipate and decline quite quickly. So I wonder, are there ways in which the police service can think about trying to I was going to say exploit, that's the wrong word, trying to harness that enthusiasm and that commitment that officers are joining the service with. The other private sector companies would love to have that level of commitment early on and just try to maintain it, rather than I think it declining quite quickly. And one of those problems, going back to the question, I've taken a funny route, but one of those reasons is because of some of those real negative attitudes, some of that real cynicism that is found in officers who don't want to remain.
Yeah. And we've got a question from Jacqueline Redgard, who asks about canteen culture and bars, and says, so obviously, what do you think about canteens, police canteens? Is it negative or positive? Apart from cost cutting, there was a knee-jerk reaction claiming the police were guilty of a canteen culture. From a mental health point of view, back in the day, this was a place and a space where officers got together and were able to debrief without taking any worries or stress home. So what do you think about the role that those canteens played?
Well, I mean, every organisation has got its own canteen culture, whether they have a canteen or not, whether it's in the kitchen, whether it's next to the photocopier. Tank Waddington used to talk about this, didn't he? He used to say, if you listen to junior doctors and the way that they talk about their patients, you'd be absolutely horrified. He argued that it was just about letting off steam. Others would disagree and say that it does reflect your cultural values, but that's for another debate. But actually, the canteen or whatever social space that you have is a fantastic opportunity, and a much needed opportunity for people to let off steam, for people to just calm down a little bit from what they're seeing, and to get that support and camaraderie from each other. And in policing terms, as we know, to tell stories, because that's a big part of occupational culture, to tell the stories about what they've been doing. Now, getting rid of those canteens in many ways has meant that social and shared space has had to move online. And we know from the Potton report that actually there's a real danger in some of those online spaces, if left to their own development, that perhaps wouldn't have happened in a more public space with a broader range of people held within it. I know from research in Amsterdam, brilliant research by Laura Kiesman, that actually there's a real danger in some of this online sharing and online chat groups. So I'm a big advocate of actually, yes, having those spaces where people can let off steam and speak and be together, and actually be able to share in some of the benefits of being a police officer. When you talk to new recruits about why they want to join, it's often about working as part of a team. You know, you're told you're joining the policing family. Well, if you don't get the opportunity to spend any time with that family, then you're only getting the downsides of the work and not the more positive elements.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And there's other thing. It reminds me of other things as well. Like, I mean, this is a bit. I guess this is more for the more senior leaders, but I know there's a lot of talk at the College of Policing now about how they regret selling off Bram's Hill because it was part of a cost-cutting thing, just selling the family silver. But now there's just this feeling, actually, there was something about doing your training in a prestigious venue which the service had invested in, which kind of said, we value you and we're willing to make this facility available to you. And if you're sort of constantly cutting corners and chipping away at that sort of thing, it kind of degrades the profession a bit.
Absolutely. And you only have to look at the amount of money that the military will spend on training its organizational members. It's a phenomenal amount that it will invest in people. And I think Bram's Hill is a kind of physical embodiment of some of that, isn't it? It was a beautiful building and people enjoyed the experience of being there and being together. Beautiful deer galloping in the garden. It's certainly not the same at Brighton, is it?
No, it's not. Absolutely not. Yes, and Louise makes the comment here. It was quite clear when I was in force that one of my inspectors felt trapped by the pension, halfway there to getting it, and anything else they went to would be a massive pay cut. And things had changed so much since they joined initially, and it was difficult to stay motivated. When it's clear that it's difficult to stay motivated, it's clear senior officers are also unhappy. So, I mean, you do have to have a way of, if people are unhappy, you have to have a way of making it easy for people to leave, as well as trying to obviously deal with the causes of the unhappiness and so on.
But make the leaving process not so unpleasant as well. I mean, the backlash that so many of our officers got when they announced they were leaving, they would either be greeted with, oh, aren't you lucky, I wish I could leave, or in some cases they'd be completely ostracized because they were leaving. And at least two of ours said that they then got a broken certificate because the glass was smashed, sent through to them. Another one said that the name was spelt wrong. So they need to get those bits right to actually value the service that people have given. Gemma Tyson, who I mentioned, who's doing the retention work with me, she's just written a paper which we hope will be published soon on those stages of leaving and the different attitudes that the police have towards those who retire after their allotted length of service and those who leave early. And we've talked about it in terms of traitors and the loyalty and the loyalists, the ones that manage to stay and the ones that don't. And that attitude from the police that you've let us down if you're leaving the organisation, there's something wrong about that.
And I think that's often the case, isn't it, in organisations where they perceive their mission to be very important, and therefore if you don't want to, if you're not staying or if you're not doing enough, then you're made to feel bad about that, and it's and that's not a healthy way of dealing with people. Catherine says here, also, I think officers become less motivated over time due to the wider criminal justice system and due to the lack of support from other organisations, mental health. So I mean, there's clearly stuff about the pressures of the job and the complexity of the job that play into all this. Now, there was a question also here about professionalisation, which I wanted to ask you. So yeah, Lindsay says, hi Sarah, what are your thoughts on the professionalisation of police officers and the impact of this on police culture by developing reflective practitioners?
An organisation, I think, can only improve through its professionalisation. I suppose it's how it's done, and the idea around professionalising policing has been around for decades, as you'll know, Rick, and it's been different forms it has taken over the years. But I think that idea of reflective practice is incredibly important. I think some of that is embedded within the degree routes into policing, which is fantastic. But but you know, that has had a really rocky road in terms of its implementation, which is really unfortunate. It came at a really bad time anyway because of COVID, so a lot of the delivery had to go online, which was very problematic, and we know that police officers don't like online education very much anyway, so that was problematic. But I think the reaction of those within the force to those coming in with these degrees has also been really challenging, and I think that's dangerous for these new recruits. And I understand that, you know, there are some, I think they're called the forgotten middle, aren't they, that there are some within policing, sergeant and inspector rank, who feel a little bit like they've been forgotten. You know, they didn't have the opportunity to get a degree. They're not getting trained in the way they should. They're not getting supported in the way they should. And they're seeing these young graduates coming in who will have, you know, something to say and will want to challenge some of the ways of doing things. And they will be perceived by many to be a threat. But that's part of the professionalisation of the service. And they've got to be allowed to be embedded within the service. But their views have also got to be heard. We're teaching students the value of reflective practice. We're teaching students the value of evidence-based policing. We don't really want them to talk about it or speak about it or try to embed it within their work. So there's a challenge in getting it embedded within policing, I think. But in principle, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, COVID and then also Operation Uplift happening at the same time. So they had this, so they had these new entry routes, and all of a sudden they had to massively increase the amount of people going through, which has just posed all sorts of logistical challenges, I think, for the service as well. That's great. Now, we also, one of the other issues that I wanted to ask you about was, obviously you're working on, you know, as a researcher, working closely with the police. And I just wanted to ask you about your perception of the relationship between policing and academia and how that has, I mean, because I think has that changed quite a bit over the course of your career, would you say, and in a positive direction?
Oh, it's changed hugely. It's changed beyond recognition, Rick, since I first started, when the police service wanted nothing to do with academics. And you know, in many ways, I can sympathise with that. You know, academics were ridiculously slow in getting work done. You know, they would often take their findings and go and report them in places that, you know, wasn't very politically sensitive in terms of the information that they'd got. And so I can see why there was a lot, you know, there was tension. And it seemed to be quite threatening from police services. I think that changed, I think, when universities started to move into police education, very slowly in many cases. But, you know, universities like ours here at Portsmouth and also University of Leicester started to work more in the education field within policing. I think that started to thaw some of those relationships. And then I think it's really started to flourish. I think, you know, potentially hit a few tricky points with the implementation of PEQF. But I think the police service, I always congratulate the police service, because I think they are an organisation who are, in principle, receptive to change in a way that other organisations aren't always necessarily receptive to change. I think if outsiders came into higher education and said, you know, you're doing this wrong, you're this wrong, and your organisational culture is toxic, we think you should do this, I can't see us not being desperately defensive about all of this. So I think they are receptive to people coming in and talking to them and finding out about them and researching them, much more open to research and much more open to working with higher education. Obviously, it could be better, you know, in all cases, but I think it's moved on in a huge way than it was 20 or 30 years ago when I first started. Yeah.
There's a question here from, now Jamie has given a description of what an institutional approach to cultural change is, but to be honest, it's a very, very detailed description, so I'm not going to read it out, but I think Sarah and I will look at it afterwards. But I think actually it's about it's partly about taking a more structuralist approach to understanding culture, as opposed to a sort of more kind of rational choicey approach, I think. So I mean, and I think that's partly reflected in some of the things you've been saying, Sarah. So, but I think Thomas also says policing needs to look at modernising incentive structures. So having talked about rational choices, we'll talk about incentive structures as a way to foster a motivated workforce. There are countless officers who may be unlikely to achieve promotion or have provided little incentive for them to raise their performance over minimal standards. These officers are often found working with or supervising new officers, sometimes adversely affecting new officers' sense of organisational commitment. So, yeah, I mean, a point here about the incentive structures may be misaligned, and that's resulting
Yeah.
in disappointed people who are causing an issue.
And I think there are two things I'd say about that. I think he's absolutely right. And I think there is a danger in people being, voluntold that they are going to be a tutor constable when they don't necessarily want to. And they're not in the mindset that they want to be helping new recruits to embed themselves within the service. So the tutor, and that was one of the findings from the culture research, is the most incredibly important person in a new recruit's career. When I spoke to the recruits after 4 years and I was saying, who's the most important person in your development as a police officer, they were still talking about their tutor, which was a 10-week period 3 years ago. When I speak to officers who've got 20 years service, they all still remember their tutor, good or bad, and that can have a real impact on them. So yes, that's one thing that I think needs to be considered. The other thing I would say is, yes, there are many officers who will never move beyond constable and who will never have that opportunity for rank promotion, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't be recognised or rewarded in different ways. And I think the police could do well to look at some of the private sector incentives in terms of rewarding, and it doesn't have to be financial reward, and I know it wouldn't be in policing, but those principles of respect, reward and recognition I think are really important. We're not going to get to the stage where it's free gym and free private healthcare, but actually there are other ways to do this. You may remember, Rick, I think it was last year, there was a huge event on social media and also in the right-wing press when it was revealed that the Met had spent 400,000 on certificates of recognition for its staff. A huge level of criticism around that. And I don't really see what the problem is. There's a lot that can be said for a worker who feels that they are valued and that their work, and their very challenging work sometimes, is being recognised. Officers are aware that they're not going to get a £1,000 bonus at the end of a month, but just to feel that they are recognised for the work that they're doing is incredibly important.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tom, I mean, this links back to what we were saying about the degree entry routes and so on. So Tom asked a question, in regards to retention, is there any early evidence of the impact of the police education qualifications framework? So all the new entry routes and how that's bedded in, is there any evidence of how that's linked, any of that links to the retention issues we've described?
I haven't got that, but there is that evidence available. The MPCC Uplift programme, the work of Lucia Leon has been looking at that, and Jeanette McCormack at the MPCC, they've been looking at that quite closely. And I think there's no doubt that the rates of attrition rather amongst new recruits who have been through that PEQF route are much higher than people leaving later on in their service. I mean, I mentioned earlier when talking about Carl, it's important that we don't lose that experience, but the numbers of those leaving in the early stages is quite significantly higher than those with a higher length of service. So yes, that data has been collected. So I think the police service are much better at collecting that data in terms of uplift. They had a really good structure around making sure they've got all the data around uplift and retention, but it's around the later stages of retention that we know less about.
Yeah, and I wanted to just give you an opportunity as we move to the end here, Sarah, to sort of say what are you? You've clearly done a huge amount of work around the police workforce and culture, leadership, retention, all of these issues. I just wonder what are your plans next? What are the next things that you're planning to work on?
My immediate concern, Rick, is whether Oxford United beat Stevenage tonight and guarantee their place in the League One playoff. But other than my immediate concern, I'm working on a number of different things at the moment. So just started working with the MPCC on a project looking at increasing diversity and representation amongst serious and organised crime roles. So we know that there's a real problem with lack of diversity in serious and organised crime. So we're doing a 12-month project on that. Gemma Tyson and I are at the moment searching around for some funding to look at retention amongst Black, Asian, minority ethnic officers, because we know that is significantly higher again than it is for white officers. So we're looking at a project in that way as well. And I suppose the last thing that I'm thinking about more broadly rather than researching on, I mentioned to you the 6 characteristics that I came up with for the book some years ago, is tinkering around with a 7th, which thinking about the issue of conformity within policing, which the more that I research in policing, the more that I see that that's really quite problematic, this drive for conformity. So I talked about the benefits of camaraderie and with other officers, but actually there's there's a price to pay for that, and that's around conforming within the system. And that's much more challenging for some officers than it is for others. So those who aren't working full time, for example, can they show that level of your ability to be a team player, which is so important in terms of your identity capital? Can they show that? Well, it's much more difficult for some officers than it is for others. So I suppose what I'm starting to think about is can the police, and I usually get some funny looks around policing audiences when I say this, can the police try to embrace non-conformity in a disciplined organisation? I know it's difficult, but that pressure for officers to conform, the benefits of conforming, I think it becomes much more difficult when we think about some of those reasons why officers don't report poor behaviour. There's a real tension for them in speaking out or laying low. And you can see why many officers will lay low, because there are costs of not conforming within policing. Either they feel they have to leave, they're ostracised, or they feel less well protected. So we've got to look at that issue of conformity and whether that's causing damage within the police service as well. So those are the things that will be keeping me busy in the next year or so.
No, absolutely fascinating, and that issue of conformity, I think, just is super interesting. Yeah, I can think of many examples of people who have been non-conformists and have actually achieved quite a lot of positive results as a result of that. So can't be healthy for an organisation to discourage that. Now, Jacqueline says, you mentioned you'd written a book. What is it called? So,
the hardest question so far. There was a book on ACPO that was called Policing and the Power of Persuasion. And then there's the book on culture amongst new recruits, which was called Police, Socialization, Identity and Culture, Becoming Blue.
Becoming Blue. And Kathy asked, this will be our last question, just because we're coming towards the end, but Kathy asked, how does policing, oh great, and Jamie's put up a link to your book. So how does policing develop an environment of individual ownership for learning, ongoing development, finding solutions, recognising when things aren't working, etc.?
I'm not sure what she means by individual ownership, but that are officers taking responsibility.
Taking responsibility, I think so.
Yeah, I suppose it's part of that drive towards professionalization, isn't it? And that ability to see yourself as a practitioner in your own, as a professional practitioner in your own right. I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because we want people to join a policing family. We want them to be very tight knit. We encourage, police services encourage them in their early training to forget everything they've learnt so far, that divestiture approach to training and socialisation. Right. You're a clean slate. We're going to tell you how to behave, what to think and what to do. It's difficult to train in that way and then at the same time want people to be taking responsibility for their own learning and their own development. I think within a rigidly hierarchical, disciplined organisation, that's quite a difficult balance. But if we can move more in that direction, then absolutely yes.
Right. Well, thanks, Sarah. That's been absolutely fascinating. And apologies, we do have to close now. So apologies to those who've asked questions we haven't got to yet. But we will. Well, if Sarah doesn't mind, we can feed it. There's just one question here, but we can feed it to you, and maybe you can have a think about it, and we can get back to the person. But I think thank you so much for your time, Sarah. It's been really appreciated, and I'm sure everyone will agree. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion with loads of food for thought, and certainly. Sarah is one of the people who I think is demonstrating that the relationship between policing and academia can generate some really important work, really positive for the future of policing. So thanks so much, Sarah, for giving us your time, and thank you all for attending. I'll just say that we have our next session on I think it's the 24th of May, and our next session is again, we're focusing on police culture, so we're continuing this discussion, and we're going to have a 4-way or 5-way conversation where I'll be talking to 2 chief constables and 2 psychologists, talking to Jim Colwell at Devon and Cornwall and Amanda Blakeman at North Wales Police, and we'll be talking to Jason Langley and Joanna Traynor, who are psychologists who've been working in these forces, looking at culture and what you can do to deal with some of the cultural issues that they've been finding. And I think that'll be a fascinating conversation which we're going to have next month. So please do sign up for that. We'll put it all on our Twitter and LinkedIn, and you can sign up in the usual way. But thanks again to Sarah for making the time, and thank you all for joining us, and have a great weekend.